Okay, good morning. Hemshech Chaim Beis, volume 2. We're on page 1202. So yesterday we finished learning the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimer in Tafresh Pei Beis, 5682, chapter 61, chapter 62 rather, the middle of chapter 62. And now we're going to go back to Ayin Beis. So what did we learn? Briefly about what is spiritual health, what is a state of spiritual lack of health, an unhealthy state, and how tshuva is refuah, is the healing. So just as it is in physical illness, in a healthy state, this blood circulation, the oxygen flow, all the life, vital, all the ruach chaim, as he called it, the spirit of life that comes through the blood and the oxygen, all is flowing perfectly. Person is completely healthy, optimal health. If God forbid there's any impediment due to disease, illness, injury, a wound, an impediment, or a disruption of the flow, or what he called before, or diminishment of the flow, so then God forbid the blood accumulates, as we learned in Pei Beis, and you need intervention. That's called refuah. To get rid of the impediments, make sure that the energy is flowing properly again, and that the wound in the particular part of the body is repaired. In Ruchnius, that's what tshuva does. Tshuva tata is primarily focusing on repairing the wound, which includes feeling sad over it, remorse, charata gemura, that complete remorse, feeling sad to the point of remorse and point of taking upon yourself that going forward will not make this mistake again. And tshuva law goes even deeper into the core essence of the person, of the soul, of the heart, crying out, that reaches the emek, the depths of your soul, your cry reaches the depths above, and in turn draws down a new energy from the root, not just the dealing with the symptoms, the remedial solution, but also one that uproots it from the root, from Maseresi Samachla Hashem Mekir B'cha, the machla, not just the cheli, the root of the illness that's rooted all the way into that passionate flames of the animal soul where it all originated from. And that's where we stopped. And so both the Pei Beis, which parallels Ayin Beis, I'm just looking at the last lines in Pei Beis, I just want to make sure. Yeah. So now we're going to continue the new paragraph on page 1202, back to Ayin Beis. And then we'll go back to Pei Beis, where he also will quote this. And I believe that's after that, Pei Beis no longer discusses these topics after we do the next section. Okay. Remember, this began, we talked in the previous page, 1201, after he finished about the cheli sheyesh b'sakana, cheli she'ein b'sakana, the illness that is dangerous and life-threatening, and one that's not dangerous and life-threatening, one that is cross the line into prohibited desires and passions, and one that's still permissive, but it's still coming from a bad place because it draws you down into a place that's not godly. So after that, he said, and what's the solution? He said, was refuah. And what's refuah? Like he said these words, which is a Gemara, was a Gemara in Pevov, Daf Pevov, I think. Yeah. In Daf Pevov Amid Aleph, 86a in Yuma. As the Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker, quotes. So now he's going back to that Maimer Chazal. And this is the statement that we said. Great is healing, is tshuva rather. Tshuva is such a great thing because it brings healing to the world. And remember, we spoke about healing to the person, which in effect also affects the world because we carry the whole world within us, including the helam of the world. That's his purpose for us to do that. So now he's going to discuss what is this refuah la'elam, healing to the world. So he says, and seemingly it needs to be understood. We need to understand why does the world need healing? In Beis, we're going to learn, I think he adds something here, but in other Maimorim, I remember for sure. In other Maimorim, it speaks about what did the world do wrong that it needs healing. But here he just says it in one sentence. Why does the world need healing? If it says Shemivir Refuah Adam, you could say because a person sins, and the sins and transgressions create the injuries or the wounds we spoke about, the pgam, that needs to be repaired. So Acha Inyan Hu, that's the way Chassidus answers, the Inyan, Acha Inyan Hu. I've heard it explained, it doesn't, sometimes, you ask a question, he says, V'yesh leimer. That's the question, now the answer. Acha Inyan means you're not just getting an answer, you're getting an Inyan, a whole subject matter. He's going to explain the subject. The question, in other words, is just it provokes us to understand the whole subject matter in a different way. So what's the Inyan? He says, Hu the Isa, the Medrash Rabbah Kehelas. It says the Medrash Rabbah, this is the famous Medrash Rabbah. We have Medrash Rabbah on Bereshis, Shmois, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Dvarim, but we also have it on all the Megillas, like Kehelas and Shirashim Rabbah and Echo Rabbah and Esther Rabbah and so on. So he says, B'Medrash Rabbah Kehelas, on the Pasuk, Der Helach v'der ba. And he says right away, chapter 1, verse 4, Aleph Dalet. So on this pasuk, which says a generation goes and a generation comes, basically talking about the passing of generations, the Medrash says the following: Ksiv. On the pasuk derel, the Medrash writes, "Machatzti v'ani erpa." I have wounded, v'ani erpa, and I will heal. So basically, it's from the pasuk in Hazinu, in the Pasha Hazinu, which is somewhat of a teichacha. Piece of Hazinu is a Shiras Hazinu, is said in a song form, but it's also Moshe Rabbeinu speaking in this song form, speaking about the Eibishter, Machasti v'ani erpa, which means I will wound. Machasti has many meanings, but the simple meaning is that there's a wound. V'ani erpa from the word refuah, and I will heal. I shall heal. Says the Medrash on this pasuk. What does the Medrash Kehelas come to add? Mechitza asisi bein helyenim v'hatachtenim. That the word machatzti also comes from another word. It comes from the word mechitza, separation, partition. That I made a partition between that which is above and that which is below, from the elyenim, the higher realms, and the lower realms. What's the partition? What's the distinction between elyenim and tachtenim? Elyenim chayim v'hatachtenim mesim. That which is above, the higher bodies, they live on, they perpetuate, and tachtenim perish, they die. That very mechitza, that partition, that separation where I distinguished, where things would live on and things would die below, things would live on above and things would die below, that mechitza I will return and I will heal it. I'll repair that mechitza. Mechitza is also a type of schism, like a schism, which is why it's connected to a wound. A wound is a form of something is cut off from something. You're separated between two things. A type of severing. So he's severed, and I will come back and I will heal it. That's the Medrash. Just as an aside, a few weeks ago when we had the Maron tragedy, so one of the things Chassidus and the Maimorim of Lag Ba'omer connect Rashbi to this pasuk, that Rashbi was a healer. That it says in the Gemara that when Rabbi Lozer looked at something and caused problem because he couldn't tolerate the pettiness and the superficiality of people's occupation, so the Gemara says that when they came out of the cave, everything that Rabbi Lozer caused, so to speak, a wound, came Rabbi Shbi and he healed it. And Chassidus explains it's connected to Machas v'Anirepra and brings actually the Mechitza, which is essentially that below there's death, and Rashbi has the power to connect and bring back life. So I spoke about it in context, of course, of Miron and the tragedy like Weimer and so on. But Kaponim, getting back to here, he's using this now to explain the question that he had asked, what does Refuah La'elam mean? So let's continue. The Inyan HaMechitza hu, what is this Mechitza exactly? That's the Medrash. The Medrash says, Machatzti, I've created a partition, a separation. I severed essentially between perpetual life, between life above and that below things perish. Now, what Elyenim and Tachtenim are can mean many things. On a very obvious level, it could be the difference between Svah Shamayim and Svah Ha'aretz. The celestial bodies like the sun, the moon, the stars, they don't die. As long as existence is standing, they remain chazakim kiyemi bottom. They're strong as the day they were created, as we learned earlier, of one of the things in Sumar Menechem, when you look up to heaven, you see that perpetuation. And Svah Ha'aretz is kayomim b'min of not the ish. So above the ish, meaning every individual celestial body, heavenly body lives on. And on earth, the species lives on, but not every individual creature. Not human beings and not chai and not semeach. So that's on a basic level. But Elyenim Tachtenim could also mean Beruchnius and Begashmius, the Shama and Guf. So I'm not going to overinterpret. I just wanted to make sure that understand what it means. So now he's going to explain. What's the Mechitza? What is this Mechitza? Especially that type of term. I mean, in Mechitza hu, Mashikosav Yehida Kia, the second day of creation, it says, the Eibishter says, Yehida Kia, there shall be a firmament, a heaven, a sky. Why? Because everything was covered in water on day one. And now the Eibishter is going to separate between the higher waters and the lower waters. So he says, so now became the oceans below and the clouds above. So now you have earth, land, and the sky and the clouds and all that. That's what happened on day 2. A Havdalah. Havdalah is another word for Mechitza, a separation. The mayim atzmichim kol minei tainug. Mayim in general, water, like he says in the beginning of Tanya, chapter 1, he says mayim gives growth, basically nurtures and nourishes all matters of pleasure, meaning everything that grows that we consume, foods and so on. Water is necessary to make it live, to make it grow, to make it flourish. So what is the difference between Mayim Elyenim and Mayim Tachtenim now? Since Mayim is the source of sustenance to all matters of pleasure, now we're not talking about necessarily bad pleasure, we're just saying all tainug. So he says, Mayim Elyenim heim amatzmichim kol tainugim haruchnim. Mayim Elyenim, the higher waters, they sprout, they grow, they nourish and make and sprout all spiritual pleasures. Umayim tachtenim matzmichim tainugim gashmim, and the lower waters, they may grow, they give growth to the physical pleasures. Okay, so what do we have so far? He's now broadened the topic of Yenim and Tachtenim, not just into physical entities in the sky and below, but he's actually talking about 2 different domains. One is the domain of above is spirituality, spiritual pleasures, and below is physical pleasures. And the pasuk now says, on this the pasuk says, Re'ei, behold, I present to you today 2 paths, Esachayim v'esatev, the path of life and goodness, and the second path, Esamoves v'esara, death and evil. So we have 2 paths in our lives to choose from. Like he writes in Likutei Torah, that's the Alter Rebbe, the Maimer Shema Yisrael and Veschanon. So he talks about these 2 paths, which is basically how you're going to choose the path of life and goodness of spiritual pleasures, or the path of physical pleasures, which is essentially spiritual death and negative energy. Baharikia. Now there's a mechitza between the two. The rakia, the firmament or the heaven, the sky, hu ha-mechitza hamavdal b'neihem. That is the partition that separates between the two. So they're two separate paths. There's a separation between the two. Like when we say, hamavdal ben kodesh l'cheil, ben er l'cheshach. But here he's talking about the Havdalah by Mayim, not er l'cheshach, because that was in day one. Here he's talking about the Havdalah day two, which is between the higher waters, the lower waters, the ethereal pleasures, the spiritual pleasures, ethereal pleasures, and the physical ones. V'hine, and now, Havdalah Sarakia, number Beis Pomim, Hirakia. That the word Havdalah is mentioned twice in the pasuk. Vayhi mavdil, vayasal lekima sarakia, vayavdil. So if you look in the pasuk, he says Vayhi mavdil, that he caused it to separate, but then it says vayasal lekima sarakia, vayavdil. So it says twice. Why does it have to say twice? Twice Havdalah. So he says like this: Ki kamoy kain. Yesh b'chinas Havdalah b'gedusha. I'm not sure how he's explaining this, but let's just read it and then I'll see. Let me just see in the Pei Beis if he adds any words that may be helpful here. Actually, he doesn't even discuss this? Oh. Oh, yeah, he does, sorry. By the way, in the Pei Beis, he does bring the medrash further, that when he means al yenim and tachtenim, he says al yenim kayomim tachtenim mesim be'elam haza. But be'elam haba, there won't be any more misa. Okay, we'll learn it when we learn it. It doesn't change anything. Just 1 second. Mavdil b'mayim l'mayim. First of all, I didn't read it completely right. It should be read like this. The Havdalah had a kia nemer Beis Pomim. One time it says Yehira kia vayhi mavdil, and the second time vayasa lekim es had a kia vayavdil. So he explains like this: Ki kamoy kain. Just as the Havdalah between the physical and the spiritual, he says, Yesh b'kedusha, yesh b'chinas Havdalah b'kedusha. We also find Havdalah, separation, in holy states, in holiness. U'kamesha kosav, like it says by the Mishkan, v'ivdila ha'pareches l'chem ben kedesh u'ben kedesh ha'kadoshim. It says when they built the sanctuary, the Mishkan, it says, v'ivdil, they made a pareches, the pareches was a curtain, v'ivdila, that's the expression, Havdalah. And this curtain separated between the holy and the Holy of Holies. So the Holy of Holies was the innermost sanctum. Then came Kodesh. So the Holy of Holies had the Aron, the Ark. The Holy had the Menorah, the Mizbeach, and the Shulchan, and the Menorah, Mizbeach, and the Shulchan. Right? And what separated them? It says there was a pareches. There was a curtain, the Ivdila. That's for sure in Kedusha, because you're talking about the Kodesh and Kodesh HaKadoshim, a separation between holy and Holy of Holies. Hainu, what is that in the worlds, in the higher spiritual worlds? It's Hainu bein Atzilus la'atik. Atzilus is Kodesh, and there's a curtain, a partition that separates it from Kodesh Kadoshim, which is Atik. That's how it is in the higher worlds. Commission Kosev, the Sifra Ditzniusa Reish Pei. That's a section in Zohar. It's called Sifra D'Tzniusa. The book of D'Tzniusa can be modesty, can be concealed. However, it's Sifra D'Tzniusa. The beginning of chapter Hey. So some of you may remember a while back, a long time back, we talked a lot about this Havdalah, the partitions, the Partitions, the partitions or the shrouds or the sheets that separated level to level. So we spoke there about partitions in Kedusha and partitions that are not in Kedusha, not in holiness. So the Maimer I'm talking about, Emer, I believe is Fartem. You want to look it up? It's on page 968 and on. He talks about the Parsois in Kedusha. Okay, so now, so we see what is this? He's going to explain this now further. Who apsik timer shebin abei shemes havaya. In the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim, let me explain what this means. In the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim, it starts off, right? Vayikra, it says Havaya, Havaya, twice. The two Yud Ke Vov Ke twice. But when it's written properly, there's a hyphen between them. In Hebrew, that's a psik timer. There's a hyphen. There are times where you write a hyphen. There are times you don't write a hyphen. The significance of a hyphen it indicates on a partition between two levels. That's in writing. That's how we express it through a hyphen. So sometimes, for example, it says Avram, Avram, psik timer. It says twice Avram. Some by Moshe it says loy psik timer. Moshe is written without a hyphen. So Chassidus explains the difference between the two is when there's a seamless flow without a partition that's required, like a tzimtzum, so to speak, or some type of leap. There's no hyphen. When there's a hyphen, it always indicates on a separation, like a curtain, like between holy and holies and holy. So he's going to explain now what that is in the two shemes havaya. So he says that this separation between the holy and holy is between Atzilus and Atik. Atik, of course, is the higher level of Keser that's higher than Atzilus. In the language, in psychological language, between the conscious and the superconscious. So he says the psik time is shebein habei shemes havaya. Shem havaya de la'elo, v'shem havaya de la'tata. So now he's bringing us back, if you recall, these two shemes he already mentioned earlier. He spoke about b'shamayim, when he says havayu elikim, b'shamayim mal, v'al oretz mitachas. So if you go back on page, I believe it's on page, let me see where it is, where he said that Shemayim Mal was the Gili of Avaya de La'ela. Right there. Okay, the bottom of page 1190. So if you look at the beginning of the paragraph there, he says, Shem Avaya de La'ela. That the difference between the two names of Avaya, one is before the Tzimtzum. The air that follows the tzimtzum, the air before the tzimtzum. So when you're talking about revealing the air habligvul, you're talking about revealing the higher havaya hu elikim, which is going to be relevant to the discussion with Eliyahu Novi, which we'll get to soon, in the next few days, I'm assuming. So he's saying the psik taima is between two levels of havaya, similar to, let's see how he says it here, Shem havaya del ela, Shem havaya del tata. Okay. That's it. That's where he stops. So what do you see? That there's Havdalah, not just, as we're going to explain in a moment, between the positive and negative, like he said, between the path of life and the path of goodness, between that and the path of death and badness, but also in Kedusha, which explains why it says twice Vayavdel, twice Havdalah, because one is Havdalah in Kedusha, and one, as we're going to learn in a moment, is Havdalah that's not in Kedusha. So now he continues. I'll explain when we finish the topic. I'll explain when we finish the whole subject. I want to see what he's going to say. I'll explain why is he bringing all these different levels, because it's relevant, obviously, to the themes that we're addressing here. But let's see where he goes here. He says this. So that's in Kedusha. Good. So what is it? Just to sum up, between the Holy and the Holy of Holies, between Atzilus and Atik, between the two names of Avaya D'Leil and Avaya D'Latat. They're both Shem Avaya. They're in that level. Okay. The Yesh Gamken Avdollah, Beis. There's also a second partition, a second separation. Lahavdil ben Akedish ben Achel. To separate between the holy and the profane, the holy and the mundane. Like we say every Mitzvah Shabbos in Havdalah, Kedish l'chel, not Kedish l'Kedish. Not Kedish and Kedish l'Kedoshim, but Kedish and Chel. The holy and the non-holy, or the mundane or the profane. And now he's going to say Chel obviously can mean weekday, mundane, the regular mundane day. He's going to say Chel also comes from the word Chela, illness. V'chel hu loshen Chela. The word Chel is from the same, is from the loshen, from the expression Chela, ill, sick, an ill person or a sick state. Why is that the case? Because we're not necessarily talking about evil. We're talking about something that's not holy. What's not holy is also v'hainu b'chinas klipas nega. The level of klipas nega, as we learned when we talked about the cheli she'ein b'sakana, was klipas nega. What does that mean? That yes, you're not doing something that's prohibited, a transgression that you've crossed the line and are being over and transgressing God's laws in the Torah, whether it's not doing a mitzvah you should be doing, or God forbid, the opposite, doing something you shouldn't be doing. We talk about klipas nega, where a person indulges in something that's allowed. But while he's indulging, the klipas nega, which is the transparent klippa shell, the one that is still a klippa, but it can be used toward kedusha, toward holiness, but it could also go the other way. That when you indulge for that time, he said it goes down into Ra Gomor. We learned. Sheyered is Ra Gomor for that time. It separates. Remember, he said Yeparid, not Los Yibadel. It detaches because you're turning away from God. Yes, you're not doing something that the Torah says you're not allowed to eat. You're eating something kosher, or you're doing something that's kosher, but you're doing it in a non-kosher way. From the person's point of view, you're using it for something complete self-indulgent that's not godly. Everything was created to elevate toward godliness, and you're going the other direction. What he called before, chel sheyeh ein b'sakana. So chel, weekday, also includes that element of chel, because it's klipas nega, shezel b'chinas machla mokar acheli. Okay, not just chel, he calls it also machla, the source of cheli. Why? Because as soon as you have klipas nega, the mere fact that something is neutral and can go in either direction is already the potential to go the wrong way. Now, obviously, you can elevate it, but he's saying that is like the nefesh habamis. In Tanya, he explained the animal soul is not a bad soul. Doesn't say anywhere it's a bad soul. It's rooted in klipas nega. That's what he says. Now, what's klipas nega? It means it's not rooted in kedusha. The nefesh halakis, the divine soul, is rooted in chapter 2 in Tanya. But in chapter 1, he says that the Nefesh Habamis it's not rooted in Shalosh Klippas Atmeis. The Nefesh Habamis is rooted in Klippas Nega. What's wrong with Klippas Nega? Because Klippas Nega means it's a klippa already. You're already focusing on the means and not the ends. As soon as you value the shell and the peel more than the fruit within, that's the root of all problems. Whether it will actually go into an illness or not, that's up to us. But the mere fact that a reality like that exists, that there's a shell that's hiding and concealing the fruit within, in other words, a tzimtzum, where you don't see the divine within, allows the potential for all the problems that will come from there. It can begin mildly with something that's just simply indulging in something that's permissible. But as we said, it could lead to who knows what. Because the concealment is the main issue here, the klippa. So though klipas nega, it cannot be called evil, but it can also be called holiness. It's neutral in a sense. So he's calling that level called machla. which I believe he said also earlier. If you go up to the third line from the previous paragraph, the third last line in the previous paragraph, he says, "Hashiresi machla mokra achil v'ubchinis klipa snega v'hainu ha'eish zar." So it's an eish zar. It's a strange passion, a strange fire, or an alien fire, foreign fire, and that can lead to everything. If we didn't have the nefesh habamis, we wouldn't be able to go anywhere. You only have a nefesh l'kis like a tzaddik has, and a tzaddik is not capable of sinning. So the eish zar is the root of the issue. That's what he's saying is chayil. So Amavda ben Kedesh l'chayil is separating between that which is holy and klippas nega, the root of all the problems. Moker hacheli, which is interesting because it's important to point out, B'chlal Torah, especially Chassidus, always focuses not on what is, but what is potential. Because the fact of the matter is, the fact that God created Tzimtzum was the purpose of it was for us to recognize and be ingenious enough to find the Father that's hiding from us. He concealed himself in order for us to find him. So the Tzimtzum itself, its purpose is Gilui. Its purpose is to reveal, just like the Tzimtzum, the concealment of a teacher's mind in order to be able to teach to a student. The concealment is not a negative, it's a positive. It's in order for the student to be able to be an independent entity, an independent consciousness, and not be overwhelmed by the teacher. But if we misunderstand the Tzimtzum, it becomes the root of all problems. In other words, the fact, just to put it in very balabatish, simple terms, the human race in general, especially the Jewish people, are one entity. We're one organism, all created by God. 8 billion people on this earth. And yet we see that one person can hurt another person. Injustice, conflict, battles, wars, murder. So ask yourself the question, how is that possible? If all are one part of one large organism from Hashem Echad, so just like in nature, you have many different species and forces, but they all complement each other. So how is it possible that human beings can turn on each other when actually when you hurt someone else, you're hurting yourself? Like the Rishalmi says about Avos Yisrael, about the Jewish people. It's like two arms of the same body. How could one arm hurt the other arm? The answer is because there's a big tzimtzum. God concealed that unity, that intrinsic, that inherent unity that connects us all, we don't see. So we can get, so now, the purpose of that not seeing is that we should be wise enough and discover it and embrace such love and unity. But the downside, the risk involved here is, and there's always a risk because it's free will, is that we will misunderstand the reason that we don't see it. We'll say, you know what? I'm a self-contained human being. I don't need that person. On the contrary, what is his or hers, I want. And we become very selfish and narcissistic and greedy. Survival of the fittest. So not only are we not looking at each other as part of one entity, we actually see each other as separate. And so the Tzimtzum's purpose was that we not buy into that delusion and understand the deeper unity and connect. And what happened is the opposite. So where does the problem begin? When a person actually hurts another person, or the Tzimtzum that allowed for that possibility? That's why it's called the root of the problem. Because obviously the Tzimtzum itself is not the problem, but is the root of the problem. Because if there was no concealment, you never could have a situation where one person could hurt another person. Just on a very practical level to explain. So Klippas Nega essentially is that state. The root of Makar HaMacheli. Okay, and now, Umechitza HaMafsekes Beinayim. And the partition that separates between them, between what? Kodesh and Chayil, basically healthy and unhealthy. Muvur b'teireir dibra maskul v'ivdila pareches lachem. So in Teireir, in the beginning, in I think it's in Noach, Hill of the Pareches. No, maybe Truma. Sorry. He says that what is this level of the mechitza? He says shahu hamakiv de levenu zacha. Okay, this needs an explanation what that means, but briefly, The mechitza Levena Zachas refers to one of the incense, one of the spices of the Yud Aleph Samamani Hakteris. So Levena Zacha, how do we translate it? That's pure. How's Levena translated? What's the English translation for Levena? Anybody know? Okay, I'll just tell you what it says in the mimer there. The Yud Aleph.
What? Yeah, I think frankincense too. No.
Frankincense, maybe. I'm not sure. I don't think so. Maybe. Well, let me just say the following: in the Yud Aleph,
it is frankincense.
Okay. And Zacha means pure. In other words, yeah. So he says like this. In Torah, he explains that the 11 different spices used in the temple, in the Mishkan, are transforming Klippa into Kedusha, because some of them come from non-kosher animals, actually, like mor. He brings mor as a b'chayet meya. Some say it's the musk, like the perfume musk, the musk animal, which is not a kosher animal, and yet you transform it. Similar to how we make perfume. They get rid of the toxins and the bad odor, let's say, of a skunk or musk or a different type of musket or a different type of animal. And it's a very strong smell, but they get rid of the negative part and you have perfume. So it's a transformation, is hapcha, from klippa to kedusha. But he says one of the 11 is the mamutza between, is mavdil, separates between the klippa and the kedusha, so it allows for that transformation to happen. That's the brief. It's not so relevant here. He's just saying it to know the level, a little advanced material here, but it's not negated so much to the actual concept. But now we know that we have a mechitza in kedusha, between holy and holy of holies, Atzilus and Atik, two havayas, and now we have a mechitza between kodesh lechoil, between the cheli, which is a negative state, and a positive state, and the mamutza, he says the mechitza, the Torah, he says this is levena zak. Okay. Frankincense, I believe, is not made from an animal, if I recall correctly. It's an actual spice. And that's why it has that, it's like a klippa snake. I think it's like the klippa, I'm not sure, I have to look it up again. Whether it's the klippa snake that separates, I don't think so. I think it's a space that separates between. I'll look inside, I'll tell you tomorrow. Umachla, hu hamafsik ben achayim el hamisa. Machla, which he said was before the mokar acheli, he says that separates between life and death. The misa umegimel klippus atmeis, right? Misa, actual death, is obviously total disconnect. That so comes from the three impure husks or shells or peels, which is not klippus nega. The klippus nega, hi hamechitza, hamafsekes, and klippus nega is the partition that separates between misa and life, which is kedusha. And now he says, I'm going to stop a moment if anybody wants clarification, but let me just finish the topic as best as I can. He says, Zehu mechitza sisi ben elyenim. All this is coming to explain the medrash that said there's a partition between the higher and the lower, between the higher waters and the lower waters, between the pleasures of spiritual pleasures and material pleasures. So he says now, and this is the mechitza that I made between those above and below. So that's the mechitza, essentially klippas nega, that separates between the kedusha and sholosh klippas hatmeis. That's klippas nega. So it's a state of machla, But the machla is the root of the problems, but it's a separation, a partition between these two dimensions. Without klipas nega, there's no partition. Now we have the partition. So spiritual pleasures would be considered kedusha, holiness. That's like pleasures in learning Torah, in doing a mitzvah, avas Hashem, b'tainugim, divine and spiritual pleasures. And physical pleasures can go both ways. It can be permitted, klipas nega, or it can go worse and prohibited. So that's the mechitza between the two. And we still have to learn what's the healing. Because remember, God is now healing this mechitza. But before I continue reading, let me stop here. We're middle of the subject. So if you may have questions, he didn't finish the subject matter. So we could wait, but just since I've been speaking for a while, if someone wants any clarity about anything, please.
Why does he say levoina zacha, pure levoina? Why does, you need to clarify that.
Because that's what it says in the Torah. Levoina zacha, that's exactly the expression. Just like we say shemen zach, you have pure olive oil. The Torah speaks about different, what kind of incense or spice you use.
That's the ingredient. I got it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so let me continue. V'yadua, and it's known. You see, this is a pretty big mouthful to explain this whole subject, but this is classic Chassidus. It elaborates the long, short way. That before answering something, it gives us a whole perspective on it. So I will try to make it make sense and easy, but I understand fully well that we introduced here a whole bunch of new subjects that we haven't heard till now. So let me finish and then I'll sum it up in a way, hopefully that makes it very clear. So he says, now he goes further, v'yadua, and it's known, the kol ha-mesachim v'ha-prasoyis mishtalshlim zamizeh. All the partitions and the curtains, there are different ways you can translate masach and parsa. A curtain, a partition, a divider, a shroud. These are all legitimate terms. You have to just find one. One could be a little thicker curtain, a lesser curtain. Paroiches is another word. But masachim and parsois are usually used in their Aramaic, especially parsois, and they're basically to talk about dividers or separators. I mentioned before that earlier in Ayin Beis in volume 2, there was literally 20, 30, 40 pages, maybe not less than that, maybe 20, 30 pages about the Mesachim, Parsois, and the Shtalshalus. So just like the human structure has different parts of the body, we also have Parsois, we have partitions. He actually talked about 3 of them. One is the throat, is like a partition between mind and the chest. Another parsha he spoke about was the diaphragm. And the third parsha he spoke about was in the brain, the membranes in the brain, in the mind. So there's many parsois, and there are more than that. Parsois basically is that whenever you build a structure, you also need to have dividers. So it's just you build a home, you need to have a hall that connects, or a divider, or a curtain, or a partition that divides, that separates one section and another. So in Seder Shtalshalus, essentially parsois and mesachim and parsois come into play like there's a parsa between Atzilus and Biyah, a special curtain. It's a form of a tzimtzum, essentially, which is a partition between a transition between 2 levels, would be the best way to really translate it. So there are partitions in Kedusha, like I said, Holy of Holies, holy. The Mishnah speaks about Eser Kedushas Hein. There are 10 levels of Kedusha. The Harabayis, Yerushalayim, within the walls, outside the walls, the rest of Eretz Yisrael, the rest of the world. So there are many levels of Kedusha. And then there is a parsa between holy and mavdil chayil, between healthy and unhealthy. And that's klipas nega that he's talking about here, which is what is most relevant to our discussion. So now he says, all these mesachim and parsois, wherever they may be, on the lowest levels or the highest level, they all evolve from one another. In other words, they all have a relationship to one another. Like he writes there in Tere'er, in the Maimer Vivdila Haparechus Lachem, that you shall make a curtain that will separate for you. We'll make for you a curtain that will separate. So Mesachim and Parsois, even in other words, in Kedusha, though it's in Kedusha, but it's still a separation. So every separation connects with other separations. But however, that's now. That's in the Seder Shtalshlus, in the structure of existence, the way God made it. Hine la'osid, in the future, and now we're going to talk about the healing. In the future, Ksiv, it says, B'yemahu yiyah vayachad shmoi. I'm sorry, B'yemahu yiyah vayachad. Sheyikula hatev v'hametiv. What does it mean, B'yemahu yiyah vayachad? Then he continues, Shmoi echad. Because today, there's a separation. For example, Keloi kashem shani nichtav kachani nikra. Today, when you write Havaya, you write it differently and you pronounce it differently. The way it's written, that's the way it's pronounced. As soon as you have something is written one way and pronounced another way, that's like a psiktaima, a type of partition. Partitions will be eliminated because they're only necessary to create a structure and a separation. There'll be the gili of Elikus, of the divine, Havaya Echad, the kulei hateva metiv. Everything will be good, this and that does goodness. So there he talked about this Havaya Echad, about the repairing of the schism of the partitions and the havdalas, the separations. V'hainu, what will be now? There's a separation between Havaya Le'ela, Havaya L'Tata. V'hainu chibur habeis shemes Havaya. That the two names of Havaya that have today a hyphen in between will be connected, will be joined. The kasher yeyer b'chin Hashem Havaya D'Le'ela yeh kulei teiv. When Havaya D'Le'ela, the Eirein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum Abli Gvul, that had to recede and be concealed because we wouldn't allow room for existence, when that's revealed, everything will be kulei teiv. You'll no longer have teiv and ra, good and evil, and life and death. Everything will only be good and life. Like we say, it'll be a day that'll be completely good and long, an endlessly long good day. Havaya, and when there'll be the connection, the fusion, the integration of the two names of Havaya, the Le'elo, the L'Tata, the Havaya above and the Havaya below, basically the Elikus as it is beyond existence, Elikus that's within existence, and there'll be no longer a distinction or a separation between them at all. Oz Yisrapu, Kol HaMechitzes, then all the partitions and all the havdalas, all the separations and all the schisms will be healed. In other words, Mechatzti, which he called a wound, because there was a separation between the upper and the lower, separations, which we said before, a separation does not mean bad, but it can lead to bad. Because as soon as you separate two things, they can have conflict. That's why it says on day one of creation, there was only Yochid, Yem Echad. The only thing that reigned there was the divine reality. It says Yem Sheni of creation was the creation of Machlekes, of conflict. Not necessarily that conflict actually happened, but as soon as you have two, day two, Vayavdel, between higher and lower, you right away have potential for conflict, for divisiveness. You also have the potential for tremendous ava, love, and unity and harmony, which is day three. That's why in day two it doesn't say kitayv. It was good because it had potential for conflict. Day three, which is shalom, harmony within diversity, takes the two and makes peace between them. So it says twice good for day two and for day three, just connecting it all. So when that Havaya these two levels of Havaya will join. The future will be the healing of all the mechitzas, of all the separations and all the partitions. Ad gama mechitza, till the point, and including even to ad gam also, the mechitza, the partition between halyenim, that which is above, v'atachtenim, and that which is below. V'hu inyan v'asirei simachla. And that's the meaning that I'll remove the illness or the root of illness. I will remove it because God is going to be, like he said, Ani erpa, machatzti, I created the mechitzas, these separations, and I will heal them, I will correct them, I will repair them. I'm just thinking where I should stop here because he continues going. You know what? Let's stop right here by Oid Yesod. It makes sense. The subject is not finished, but we'll stop here 3 lines from the bottom of page 1202. Anybody want to ask anything? So it's coming together. He's basically bringing together what he was speaking about, the illness and healing. I know we moved away strong from Chelas Ava, but Chelas Ava, even the highest levels of Chelas Ava now seem to make sense that there is also a separation. It's just a separation between seeing and literally, I don't want to say gloating, but seeing and aching because you can't have the godliness. So even the highest level, I would say, is also a form of a parsa, except it's on a very, very high level. So maybe that brings it all together, the highest levels of Chelas Ava, all the way to the lowest levels of Chelas Sheyesh Basakana, an illness that's dangerous. That is my own thought. I'm not saying it's for sure the case, but it sounds like that to me. But you know what? I'll wait to conclude that when we finish this subject, which will be in the next page. But bottom line is, we are discussing the repair now, the healing. That he said the main healing, remember he said back on page 1200, Asher harafu amitis tila osid, when we'll have Riyas Amahuz Bizgalus Mamish, and it'll be Bechina Shuv, Rotze and Shuv. So in the future now, he's saying the ultimate healing is going to be in the future of the Osid Love, where all the divisions and all the partitions, everything will be healed. So really, it's going to come back to Vayidaita Yem Vashavis Alech Kevayu Elikim B'Shamayim Amal Va'Aretz Mitachas will be revealed, L'Osid Love. So we'll see the divine in existence and the divine beyond existence, and they too will connect, Eish Hey and Eish Yud, that we'll soon be learning about more. And that's the context of what we're discussing now. How we correct and connect after there's been separations to the point of even sin and transgression. Tshuva, as we're talking about here. So it's coming together, and